Welcome back. We're talking to author and academic Martin Jacques. His book, When China Rules the World, has been translated into 15 languages and is an international bestseller. Martin, let's get back to the conversation here. Something you said earlier on about China's influence politically, diplomatically on the world stage. We also see Europe moving more towards China and East Asia. That's changing. The Belt and Road Initiative is changing that. China's role economically around the world is changing that as well. How do you see China influencing political and global alliances that currently exist?
Well, I think that as China's risen, then its gravitational pull, primarily economic, but more recently of a variety of political and diplomatic forms, has got steadily greater. And the most powerful expression of this has been in this region, in East Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, and both mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. And I think that, but you can see this all over the world, particularly China's gathering momentum in its relationship with developing world, Africa, Latin America, and with Belt and Road, Central Asia, and so on. So this process is happening, actually, in historical terms, extremely rapidly. It's not a linear process. It has setbacks, because there's also resistance and sometimes opposition to China's influence. Or if China misplays something, then, which is understandable, then you get a setback. But basically, the historical trend is very clear, and it's overwhelming. And I think that's extremely important to recognize. In Europe, well, Europe is certainly, Europe does not have the problem the United States has. The United States, more and more, as China's risen, has come to see China as a threat to its own position. Europe has no such illusions anymore. It does not consider itself to be a global power like the United States does. So in that sense, it's more open-minded, and also recognizes that in some ways it might be needy of China. Now, that's more true of Eastern Europe and Central Europe than it is of Western Europe. So I can see a process by which Europe does move in the direction of China to a greater extent. I don't want to overstate the case, though. Europe is a mess. It's in the midst of a major political and economic crisis. It's got a very big governance crisis, and therefore I think that, and I can't see it pulling out of this situation anytime soon. You know, when a continent goes into decline, it's very difficult for it to come to terms with that decline. And Europe is in deep decline. It's not just, spasmodic decline or recent decline, it's a historic decline. And how do you come to terms with that? And no one should be under illusions. There is no easy solution to that kind of thing. It actually goes on for decades. I mean, my own country, Britain, is a wonderful example of a classic subject for study of what happens when you decline. By the way, China had the same problem, of course, from around, well, I think it dated earlier than most people. I dated from the early 19th century to 1949. China found it very difficult to pull out of decline, and eventually, magnificently, of course, it did, starting with Mao's revolution in 1949.
Right. If we look at China's growing influence around the world, you point out that here in the United States, there will be resistance. It will not be something that the United States will accept. Will that resistance lead to tensions?
Well, we can see that already, because Donald Trump, as president, is an expression of a big shift in American attitudes and a consequent shift in American foreign policy. Now, what is this all about? I think that's the big question. And I think that what it's about is that Trump, in a sort of perverse way, is the first leading American politician to recognize that America is in decline. Of course, he thinks he can reverse it, and pigs can fly. He's not going to reverse it. But he at least has clocked it. So what's his response? His response essentially is a withdrawal of America from its global role to try and reconstitute itself and so on. Now, this isn't going to do the trick. It's not, you know, it won't achieve that aim. But the consequence of America, it's such an important country in the world, is that it's breaking the kind of ties and treaties and alliances, and it's weakening the cohesion of international organizations and so on. And that, I think, is the consequence. So that, and of course, also, for the first time, I think, since the Cold War, the serious prospect of a threat to world peace exists with Trump.
Yeah, that withdrawal that you talk about, the American withdrawal, inward looking, America first, that policy, that, in a sense, gives China an opportunity to be more assertive on the international stage, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, a classic example was Xi Jinping's speech last January, after Trump's election, before his assuming office, at Davos, you know, about globalization. And I think that is the first time in modern history that a Chinese leader's speech has been eagerly awaited across large parts of the world, absolutely including Europe. I mean, people were waiting to see what he was going to say. And of course, what he said was what they really wanted to hear, which is the future is, you know, globalization. Although, quite rightly, Xi Jinping's emphasis is not on the Western-styled globalization, but on a more balanced, sustainable globalization. So China has become, you know, China is the new force for a different kind of globalized world. And, you know, Trump, of course, is quite wrong. You know, we're not, in the long run, globalization is an unstoppable force. But it can go into periods of retreat, as we've seen in the past. And so China now, the key question for China is how it can provide this connectivity, if you like, of relationships in a globalized world. And that's one of the great challenges that China faces. And I think that you know, the chances of it, it's difficult to say how successful it's going to be, because, you know, the Trump phenomenon is not to be underestimated. But I think China can do very well.
Right, but the Chinese view of globalization is very different from the Western view, isn't it? The Western view of globalization is that you have to become more Western as globalization takes over. The Chinese don't believe that.
Yeah. Well, no, there are two things I think about Western-style globalization. One is exactly your point, which is that globalization was not just an economic project; it was a political project. It was, you know, it was Western modernity on a global scale. You know, modernize and become like us was the Western dream. 1990s, you know, and it wasn't just the right. You know, people like Clinton and Blair were, you know, big proponents of this kind of attitude. To my regret. And the second aspect of globalization that was wrong in the West was this kind of, you know, go for it globalization, and to hell with the consequences of it, really. It was ill-balanced. So people, those sections that weren't part of it, suffered badly. And of course, eventually it's come home to, you know, it's bitten back. Because who are the people that supported Trump? Well, you know, it's the people in the Midwest whose wages, white male workers whose wages have stagnated basically since the 1970s. And if I look at my country, exactly the same problem. So, you know, globalization, great for those parts of the country that do well, but terrible for those parts of the country that have simply been left behind. Now, actually, China can't do that kind of globalization for itself, because China's unity, stability, is so dependent on balanced development. So if China does something like that, the consequences for China itself would be very serious. So China has a different mentality, a different way of approaching this. So yes, you know, different kind of globalization politically, different kind of globalization economically in terms of sustainability.
No, it's not all smooth sailing for China. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges ahead?
Well, you know, I remember when my book came out in China, and people used to say to me, well, you know, I think you're too optimistic. We've got so many problems. And I said, I agree you've got so many problems, but you've got to put it in historical perspective. You've got to understand where things are moving. Of course, you know, I was right actually. So far I've been right anyway. Chance fate with it. But the thing is that I think China does always face very serious problems. I mean, I don't think we should make light of that. Can the economic developments be sustained? So far, I think the restructuring and so on has been going better than many people expected. I think they've done very well. But that is still an ongoing challenge, because without the economic dynamic, a lot of other things could never happen. And then, I mean, I think inequality actually is a big question for China, and should become more of a priority in China, because if you neglect those who aren't doing so well, it can bite back.
This is wealth inequality?
Wealth and income inequality. You know, the Gini coefficient in China is one of the highest in the world now. In the Mao period, it was one of the lowest. So, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons for it, but I think that is a sort of something to beware of and that needs to be dealt with. Corruption, I think the Chinese have been excellent on the way they've handled corruption. Very, very important, not just for China, but for the rest of the world, to set an example. I think my biggest concern in the short to medium term is actually what Trump is going to do and how China's going to handle that. I mean, I definitely don't rule out a serious trade war. And the consequence of that will make the situation much more difficult for China. Mm-hmm. So I think that is another sort of a challenge that is right there before us now.
Sounds very ominous, but Martin Jacques, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.